Welcome to another teaching from perfectingtheworld.com.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us for another evening field note study. It's good to have you here as we're continuing in our learning from the Torah about biblical food boundaries and about the ranked and stacked severity of food boundaries in the written Torah. We are now in part 5, and we've been exploring from the scriptures, from the Hebrew scriptures, what the significances are of the biblical Torah food boundaries. And today I posted something that I think was a little bit provocative. I'll show that slide here in just a moment. I think some of you may be here because of that post. I want to start off here by stating that we fully affirm the authority of the Torah of Sinai. We fully affirm the authority of the mitzvot, of the commandments that God gave at Sinai. And by no means am I telling anybody to dislodge themselves from the table of Israel. That is, I'm not trying to get anybody to stop being apprenticed to the revelation of holiness at Sinai. What I am trying to get people to understand is the specific place, the covenantal place that the Torah obligations rank into and how they function. And by understanding that, I want people to understand the call to move upward and to ascend to Sinai, to ascend to Zion. With that said, this is the post I made today. This is a quote from Bereshit, from Genesis 9:3. It says, "Kol remes asher chai lechem yeheh la'achla," that whatever moves shall be food to you. This is revealed and given right after the flood event. And we're going to contextualize this a bit. I'm aware of the traditions that many have inherited for how to understand this. Many people will take this passage specifically and put it under the categories of the animals brought into the ark in Genesis chapter 7 and chapter 8, or they will make it uh, align with what's revealed in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. We're going to take this passage differently today, and one of the highlights throughout this entire learning experience is going to be this. This might be a little bit offensive, and I'm sorry, but I'm standing by Torah here, and I am not going to back from this. But the prohibition against pig has become sort of a metaphorical idol. It's become an absolutized prohibition from the Torah, but in a way that, as we're going to highlight here shortly, has put the Torah in service to alien and to foreign ideas. The first area in which this happens is that the prohibition against the chazir, the Asur Achilat Chazir, the prohibition against eating pig, has been absolutized in such a way that other biblical prohibitions get completely shadowed over. Many who are in this Torah affirming movement will speak repeatedly about the prohibition against shellfish and pig, especially pig, but then have no knowledge about the prohibition against nevela or terefa or the prohibitions against chelev. Okay, other fundamental biblical prohibitions that are a lot more severe in their consequences in the Torah. And we see this quite often. The other area is putting the prohibition against pig in such a capacity that it ends up flatlining Torah categories of identity. Specifically, and we're going to just crack open the door today slightly on this topic, and this is the Torah identities of the Nokri, of the Ger Nevela, and Israel. Okay, and what ends up happening in this capacity is the gates get shattered, the boundaries of what defines Israel covenantally in the Torah get erased, and the gate gets mistaken for the altar in a way that is prematurely realized. And I must emphasize this: I am the biggest advocate of non-Jews apprenticing their table to the table of Israel received at Sinai. I'm a big fan of that. I'm not asking anyone to step back from the way that this calling has impacted your life, but I am calling for an awakening and an awareness of the man-made traditions that have impacted how people have learned Torah. The post that got me this morning was this post here, okay? And this is God's hummingbird, Michelle Schilling, and I appreciate her. She's been taking a stand for the Jewish people. She's been standing for the Torah for, I think it's been a long time. I appreciate her heart for obedience. This is nothing about her at all personally. We've had some recent correspondence about the Noahide commandments and possibly doing a collaboration live. And she posted this, and this is not new. I see this almost every day. And the argument made is this: is that pig is not food. The Torah does not say that pig is food. Okay. And what I'm realizing as I'm observing this from within the Jewish framing, what I'm realizing is that many in the Messianic and the pronomian world, especially those who are more Torah affirming, they feel the need to constantly defend their commitments to Sinai. They feel a need to do apologetics. In fact, I would say probably 80% of the posts I see from the Messianic and pronomian worlds have to do more with defending identity and apologetics, defending against Christian claims that the Torah is abolished. More about that than about how to actually live a life of Torah compliance, how to actually walk in the Torah and to observe the mitzvot. I would say that that is the primary focus within these worlds. And what what I'm seeing, and I'm not pointing a finger at this moment. Okay, what I'm seeing though, as I've mentioned already, is that many have made their refraining from pork or the prohibition of pork into this center of gravity. The logic goes like this, quote, "I am Israel." Okay, and why are they Israel? Well, because they they bring in these Protestant, Lutheran, Calvinistic, later evangelical doctrines of imputation, of justification, of identity, read through a particular reading of the epistles of Paul, and a reading, quite frankly, that Paul would be embarrassed to know his letters are being used to promote, but they're importing this theology, this ecclesiology, into the boundaries of Israel that were defined at Sinai. And what they're doing is they're using a number of the beautiful commandments that they're welcome to observe and that I encourage them to grow into the observance of these commandments, but they're bringing them in so early that they're mistaking the gate for the altar, that the entrance has been corroded, the boundaries have been demolished, and they're identifying prematurely. Again, because of these Protestant doctrines, they're identifying as Israel prematurely. Now, I hold a very expansive view of the prophetic horizon. I very much see in the Hebrew prophets, I see an assimilation happening. What kind of assimilation? Not Israel into the nations, but I see an upward call of the nations to participate in the Mizbeach, in the altar. And how so? The house of prayer for all nations entails the idea of an assimilation upward, an assimilation into Israel, a civilizational, a generational assimilation into Israel. And that is part of the vision of the Geula, of the redemption that the prophets speak of. And so I am a full advocate of someone moving into the realm of full Torah practice, even though the individual may not biographically need to arrive there in their own lifetime. The Torah is clear on that. At the same time, there is this vision of uplift and assimilation. But what happens when this identity gravity comes in too soon, what happens is when the boundaries are not recognized, the individual fails to apprentice themselves to the Torah of Israel, and the boundaries get shattered, and the the bar gets lowered, the arrow is shot, and they draw the bullseye around the way they live. So rather than ascending the mountain and walking and ascending to the altar of Israel, they're bringing it down to where they're at, and they're calling it holy. It's a shame. It really is. And this is part of why I'm so passionate on this. Now, here's the other side of the equation. We have the identity side. Now let's look at what's often framed as a health idea. This is from another Facebook post today, and look at the section in highlight. First of all, it reads, the biblical dietary laws are not suggestions or commands to just control you. Okay, so the person is saying it's not just because God said, but rather their divine wisdom for your health from the one who created the clean and unclean animals in the first place. You know what? And he might be completely right. He might be completely correct. However, we don't know this. The Torah never tells us that these commandments regarding what's permitted and what's prohibited are for health. In fact, as if you go back to the first or second class in the series, we saw how biblically clean is not the same as healthy. In fact, there are many examples of healthy foods that are biblically prohibited for Israel, like the ostrich, very nutrient dense food, but biblically prohibited. Krill, open water swimming crustaceans. They are very high in antioxidants. They are higher in omega-3 fats than even cod liver oil, but they are biblically prohibited for Israel. And then likewise for the chicken, it's a kosher species, but it's an opportunist omnivore and a scavenger. It will cannibalize other chickens even while living. The carp, as a similar example, is a kosher species. However, the carp is long-lived with fatty tissues. It is a bottom feeder, and its tissues will often be full of heavy metals, not the good kind, but like mercury and metals that can poison and be very unhealthy. It is, however, a kosher species. This is part of how we learn the idea that biblically clean is not the same as healthy. Okay, this idea that biblically clean is the same as healthy. It is literally a tradition of men. Okay. And what I'm calling for you, the listener, to do is not to apprentice the Torah to your culture. Go back and watch the previous videos for more about that particular that cultural component. But what's happening, and this is partly because of the translation of the words, the word clean carries the idea culturally as being healthy. Unclean carries the idea culturally as being dirty. Now, these words, the clean, unclean, in the Hebrew, it's a different range of meaning. But I'm saying here in the translations, particularly in the English that I'm familiar with, when we make clean equal healthy, we've made a new center of gravity, and we put Torah into that center of gravity. And we bend the Torah around the idea of clean being healthy. And that leads to many misunderstandings about how the Torah functions. It disorders the priority of Torah, where the reason in Torah that a particular commandment regarding clean or unclean is observed is given as a Wadaber Adonai, that is, thus says Hashem. That's the only reason why we do it. If we happen to find health benefits, that's great. But if we make the first foot forward, science, or health benefit, we risk disordering that the fundamental reason why these commands exist is because Hashem commanded them. And second, we obey them because Hashem commanded them. We have to have enough trust in the God that revealed them to be able to obey things that are not given a rational explanation. And this leads to the heart of, I think, part of what is so challenging for those in the Messianic and Hebrew roots world and pronomian worlds to work with. They're often trying to encourage their Christian family and Christian associates that the Torah is still valid. And quite often, the way that logic goes, the way the process goes, the way that the apologetics go, is that they try to show that the Torah, or that Torah prohibitions and Torah clean maps onto the idea of healthy and unhealthy. Pig promotes trichinosis. Pig might have protozoa. Pig has parasites. Pig might lead to heart disease. All these ideas that the Torah doesn't tell us, but because they're appealing to nature. It's called alpe teva. They're appealing to nature. They're appealing to nature, to people who haven't accepted the supernatural nature of the Torah. When you've accepted that the Torah is supernatural, you don't need nature to explain why you keep the commandments. You accept them because of the authority of God. Now, the appeal to nature might make a nice, meaningful, ancillary, tertiary, later level of understanding, but they're not the fundamental framing that we receive in the Torah. And this is really important to understand that. Really important to understand that. So, what is clean unclean? Well, I mean, the first time we encounter the idea of clean unclean is in Genesis 7. Okay, it says here, Genesis 7:2, Mikol habehema hatahora techach lecha sheva sheva ish ish to. From all the ritually pure animals, you are to take 7 and 7, each a male and his wife or his mate. Many say, okay, well, there you go. We already have biblical food laws, so to speak, in the Torah. It goes on to read here, and it's funny that they say that. I mean, like I said, there's a, a whitewashing or an eclipsing of other requirements, but this is the focus. It's the clean unclean. But the Torah tells us the reason for this distinction of clean and unclean. It reads Genesis 8:20. It says, "Vayeven Noach mizbeach ladonai, vayekach mikol habehema hatahora, umikol ha'of hatahora, vayal oloth hamizbeach." Noach built an altar to Hashem. He took from the pure animals and from all the pure birds, and he offered up an offering on the altar. The reason for the distinctions at this level were not the table. They were they were the altar. The assumption is made, way too far reaching, that the reason at this point was for the table. No, it was for the altar. In fact, what's fascinating is this is something profound because at Sinai, this isn't allowed. It says that Noach vayekach mikol habehema hatahora. He took from all the clean species, umikol ha'of hatahora, and all the clean birds, and he offered elevation offerings. What happens at Sinai's altar? At Sinai's altar, one cannot bring a deer, a giraffe, a buffalo, a mountain goat to the altar. The only mammals offered on Israel's altar are the sheep, the goats, and cows. You can see here a distinction right out the gate. The function of the separation of clean and unclean at this point is specifically for the Avodat Hashem, for the purpose of the altar. This is why we saw earlier on that the word tahor, often translated as clean, carries the idea of being altar ready, being altar fit. In a similar sense, the word tameh, often translated as unclean, means not being altar ready. The clean unclean translation becomes its own center of gravity, its own man-made tradition. If we go back to this passage and we sit and read Genesis 7:2, Mikol habehoma hatahora, from all the altar qualified animals, you are to take 7 and 7, each a male and his mate. Again, it's the concern there is the altar qualification. Okay, the center of gravity here at this point is not the table, it's the altar. And the altar here is different than the altar of Sinai. This is an altar for all clean species, an altar only of olah, of elevation offering. Now, notice right after Genesis 8, where the offerings are brought, we go to Genesis 8:20. And it tells us, Kol remes asher hu chai, every living thing that has life, lechem yehye la'akla, shall be for food, kayerek hasev, like the herb of the grass, nathati lechem eth kol, I have given you these things to eat. It says everything with life in it. At this point, the altar was limited to animals that were ritually qualified, but the table of humanity was permitted to have whatever moved. So pig was on the menu. But the text goes on to say, it says, Ak, basar, banafsho, damo, lo tokelu. However, flesh with its life, its blood, you are not to eat. This is a prohibition against eating from an animal, eating the flesh of an animal that still has its life in it. Okay, we can go further into that, but now this is the only qualification given. Okay, the word ach, I pulled here from the Braun Driver Briggs. It means howbeit in contrast with what precedes it. It's a restrictive word that emphasizes what follows, saying you can eat of all animals, however, basar banasho damo lo tokelu, flesh with its life, its blood, you shall not eat. If the Torah at this point wanted to assert the not eating of unclean species, it would have said ak basar lo tahara. It would have said, however, flesh that is not clean. At this point, that is not the concern. At this point, we are looking instead at a prohibition that maps specifically on to the flesh of an animal that's living, and this is an allowance for eating all foods. Going back to our previous learning, we looked at the word karaith, and we left the previous class with this question: Are there food boundaries that are consequenced by karaith? Are there food boundaries that carry the consequence of karaith? Karaith, as you'll recall, means to be cut off. It means to be removed. There are three primary meanings. The first meaning being removed from life in Olam Haba, the age to come. The second is a generational removal from the covenantal people of Israel. And then when the temple stands, it can actually mean a premature death. It can mean all three of these things. But it's important to understand that karaith, as we come across it in Torah, is not punishment by humans. It is not excommunication. It is punishment by the hand of heaven. And I need to emphasize this, that karaith is not an absolute metaphysical, irreversible status. It is something that can be remedied through teshuvah. If a person confesses wadoy, their transgression, does teshuvah, in the cases where necessary, doing restoration and return, they can be remedied. The karaith, the being cut off, only holds insofar that the person remains in a willful position in that transgression. These are the offenses, the 36 offenses in the Torah that have karaith as a consequence. I put into purple the ones that involve eating. There are specific foods and specific eatings that are consequenced by karaith. Okay, a few of them to look at is first of all eating chametz. You read here in Exodus 12:15, Shivat yamim matzot tokelu, 7 days you shall eat unleavened things. Ach, like we saw before, however, but Yom HaRishon, on the first day of the head day, tashbithu she'or mibatechem, you shall cause to sabotage or to cease the she'or, the mother leavening products throughout your houses. And what happens? Ki kol ochel chametz, whoever eats chametz, v'nithrach v'nichratha hanefesh ahi meYisrael, that person shall be cut off from Israel. Notice, nothing here is called unclean. Okay, this is part of why, as we mentioned early on, we don't use the word clean or unclean as a measure of prohibition. Rather, the concern here is chametz. The substance of chametz is prohibited. It's never called unclean. Another example of a karaith involving food involves eating the holy meat that was offered on the altar, a zavach, while a person is willfully maintaining a status of being unclean. It says, whoever eats the flesh of an offering, a communion fellowship offering, so mizavacha shalamim, a fellowship offering, asher ladonai, that's made to Hashem, utumasu Allah, has his uncleanness upon him, when nechratha hanefeshahi me'amea, he shall be cut off from his people. Okay, notice here the reason why there's a karaith is because he's unclean, knowingly, willfully unclean while eating from a zavach shulamim. Okay, and what is the unclean? What is unclean here? The person, not the food. The food's clean. Okay, this is why we saw earlier in Deuteronomy 12:15 it says, "Rak b'kol awath nafshecha tizbach v'akalta basar v'virchat Adonai." You shall eat whatever you desire according to the blessing of Hashem. It says, "Wahatame wahatahor yokalenu chatzvi wa'akal." The unclean and the clean alike may eat of it. Okay, unlike food that's being brought to the altar, in which a person has to be in a state of ritual qualification, ritual readiness, altar fit. In contrast, food that's being eaten while the person is not altar qualified is fine when they're eating chulin, common food that's not for the altar. We already mapped this idea that the book of Leviticus and Numbers is giving its food restrictions primarily in the context of the tabernacle community, where tabernacle purity is foremost. Deuteronomy moves the food regulations from the area of tabernacle purity to the area and realm of covenantal identity. Another Kareth prohibition. It says, "Hukath olam lo dorotechem b'kol meshivotechem kol chelev v'kol dam lo tochelenu." It shall be a perpetual statute for all of your generations that you shall eat neither fat. The word fat there is chelev and blood, and the fat comes from the specific organs that we know from elsewhere were brought onto the altar. It goes on to say, next, this is 725. Ki kol ochel chelev, whoever eats the chelev, the forbidden fat, specifically of a cow, sheep, or goat, mina behema asher yachriv mimena, from any animal that is able to be brought, ishel Adonai, as a fire offering or as a zavach to Hashem, when nekratha hanefesh to keleth me'amea, that person shall be cut off from his people. Again, chelev and dam, blood, are not unclean. They're not unclean. But the consequence is kareth for a willful eating of these things. So what does Torah specify as the consequence for eating pig? Is the punishment, is the consequence kareth? Well, there are two consequences in the Torah for eating pig. The only time that kareth would happen for somebody who has eaten pig, as far as a kareth punishment, is if they go into the tabernacle, into the holy sancta, while having the contamination, the tumath chazir, the contamination of a dead pig on their body. We saw this passage already, Leviticus 7:20. Whoever eats from the fellowship of shalom offering, asher ladonai to Hashem, utumathu Allah, with his ritual disqualification on him, then you shall be cut off from his people. Now notice, this is the only way that a kareth punishment could be applied to somebody who ate pig. There is no kareth consequence for eating pig. But now there could be, within the jurisprudence of Israel, a consequence for eating pig. If a person deliberately eats pig, there have to be three requirements. There are 2 or 3 vetted witnesses. They warn the person against eating it. The person accepts acknowledgement of the warning and eats anyway, and it's brought to a court of judges. At that point, there could be malkuth for any offense of Torah. There could be malkuth for that. So now the question is, when is pig food? Well, we saw in Genesis 9:3. I'm not going to go over this verse again. That pig can be offered, can be eaten as food. There's one other case in the Torah where pig can be food. That case is in Deuteronomy 14:21. We're only going to briefly open this door. I'm going to leave you on a cliffhanger with this. This verse reads, Lo tochelu kol nevela. Do not eat any nevela. By the way, there's an English traditional translation that gives an example of nevela, but not the definition of it. That translation is that which dies of itself. Something that dies of itself is an example of nevela, but that's not the definition of nevela. Nevela is a carcass. So it should read here, whoever eats any carcass. Asher b'shareka, it says, Lager asher b'shareka, you can give it to the sojourner in your gates. Titana wa'achala, to give it and to eat it. They're allowed to eat it. O mechor lanachri, you can sell it to the alien. Why? Ki am kadosh ata ladonai Eloheka, because you are a holy people to the Lord your God. Highly significant that the purpose for the dietary restrictions are given here in this Torah as the election of Israel. It's covenantal identity. But this nevela, which we're going to briefly touch on the meaning of nevela, we're going to continue on this study later, but we're going to touch on this meaning of nevela. This nevela can be given as a gift to the ger to the sojourner who is living in your gates. And the Nachri can be sold to. The idea here is that ger is within your gates. This is somebody who's at peace with you. This is somebody who has accepted the prohibition against avodah zarah, against idolatry. They're able to eat this nevela. So what is this nevela? We're going to give you a very literal, very slavishly contextual definition of nevela. In Deuteronomy 14:8, okay, we just read from 14:21. In 14:8 it says, but nivlatham refers, you can see the word nevela. Okay, this is a construct possessive. 14:8 uses the word nevela to refer to the chazir, the pig. That's the only other place this word nevela is used in Deuteronomy 14. It's referring to a pig. If you were to contextually read this within the horizon of just this chapter, the nevela being referred to that's given to the ger to eat, or to the nokri, is a pig. It's a pig. It's a pig carcass. This is the second time the Torah is calling pig food. It's being given here as part of a welfare system. A few verses later, 14:28 and 29 refers to the ger who receives the second tithe, along with the widow and the orphan. There's a different interpretive tradition with that in the halakha, where it refers to the ger Pesach, the ger Zedek. But contextually, in a pure Peshat reading, it appears to me as though the concern there is for the welfare of the ger nevela. This is a vulnerable status. It's an immigrant. It's somebody who is seeking to make their home within Israel, somebody who has chosen to apprentice themselves to the Torah of Israel, to orient themselves to the God of Israel, who has given up avodah zarah for the worship of the God of Israel. In this case, pig is food for them. This is what the Torah says. I'm not making this up. This is what the Torah says. We're going to expand on this meaning of nevela as we continue learning. But we've seen a few things. First of all, the most severe food boundaries in Torah do not center on pig. Number one. Number two, a flatlining of identity, particularly through Christianity's received identity theologies, tends to realize the altar for people who are just at the gate. And by doing that, it causes them to fail to grow in Torah. It causes them to stay at the gate and to absolutize the gate as though it were the altar of Israel. And it stagnates them. It holds them back while at the same time claiming to already be Israel. That's a huge issue. And second, this idea of the health component, the health laws, it results in making Torah subservient to later cultural ideas. If any of you have any questions specifically about identity, specifically about how to read Paul, I'd be happy to have the discussion with you. This is not the place for it right now. But a question I'm going to leave with you is this, and please answer in the chat, answer below. Why would God differentiate the table of Israel from that of the stranger at the gate? You know, we could also ask the question, just as important, is why would God allow something like pig to the stranger at the gate? So many have made chazir, pig, such a metaphysical absolute, such a part of even like God's absolute essential nature, that they can't allow for this reading. They make the Torah apprenticed to their metaphysics and to their ideas and their framings. And the fact is, no, the Torah treats the prohibition of pig in relationship to ritual purity and in relationship to covenantal identity. Okay. Not as a metaphysical absolute, but as a reality that is oriented toward the altar of Israel and that feels the altar of Israel as its center of gravity. And I do want to encourage you to subscribe and comment below about why would God differentiate the table of Israel from that of the stranger of the gates. And trust me, I'm not trying to push anybody out. I'm identifying the biblical boundary in order to draw you closer to Israel's table and to Israel's altar. I encourage those who have not done so to go to Perfecting the World to register for our and join our community of online learning. We have chat forums, which we try to be active on daily. We have classes very much like this every Tuesday evening at 8 p.m., every Sunday morning at 10 a.m., unless we cancel in advance. I'm traveling next week, so we will have a disruption in the schedule. And I encourage you to join and learn with us. The kind of learning you saw this evening is what we do on a regular basis. As always, it's been an honor to learn with you today, and I look forward to your comments and to your contributions. Have a great evening.
Join the perfectingtheworld.com community today.